Hello, so today I've got a new video for you guys, and this video is going to be a commentary and time-lapse of a new scene I've been working on. So this scene I ended up making purely by accident really, after I was doing some sculpting practice. So to start off with, I actually did sculpt quite a few rocks as a sort of a practice. And I lost the footage for this, so I haven't got that to show you. But after I had done all the sculpting, I thought, well, I may as well try and see if I can sort of put these into some sort of composition. So right here, I'm starting to just duplicate the rocks around, seeing how well they fit together in sort of their organic forms. And this ended up working really well, surprisingly. And this is the point where I decided to take it further and end up retopologizing and baking everything down for Unreal 4. So also at this point I was looking at trying to get the ground plane in. Obviously I needed something to have the rocks sit around, so I was thinking of having a stream sort of run down the middle and have the rocks on the outskirts of this sort of rocky, mountain-esque type environment. Now one thing you can see here at the end, I obviously needed to hide the end of the perspective of the composition, otherwise you would just see an empty void. So here I'm trying my best to block it with the rocks. So once I was happy with that, I then needed to figure out how I was going to create the low polys and unwrap. Now, I ended up going with Blender's decimate options in the modifiers, and this worked really well for getting the low polys, as retopology for more organic shapes is always very difficult. So I was quite happy with the results of that, and at this point I'm trying to figure out the best way to unwrap these organic shapes, and I was trying to project in 4 directions. However, the outcomes of these projections weren't that great. So what I'm figuring out at this point is seeing where I can put the seams in and what is the best way to try and merge these or hide these seams along the edges of the rock. Now there wasn't really a clear way of doing it, although gradually I worked out a pretty good process for getting the UVs fairly seamless and even on each side. So I looked at the rock and tried to break it down into 4 key sides per se, and I'm trying and adjust. Gradually I got this, and I noticed some of the sort of where the edges of the seams are sitting, they're not that straight, they're kind of all jagged. So in here I'm adding in some extra edge loops to try and make the edge or the seams a bit cleaner. And once I was happy with that, I was just adjusting the UV shells as best as possible. And then I quickly tested the normals, and these seem to work really nicely. So all seemed good, and I was able to go from there. So as I said before, decimate the high poly to get the low poly, and then here I was still using my old process of trying to automatically unwrap the shells. However, this didn't work that well, so I opted for just using the brush tool, selecting the faces and then projecting that as one shell. There were a few areas with the decimate that I had to clean up, but that's to be had when you're dealing with sort of automated generated meshes from modifier. But overall the quality wasn't that bad. So again, I'm going in, cleaning up those seams where they are a bit wonky, just to make them a bit neater. And now I'm just placing the UV islands. I mean, I didn't optimize them greatly, mainly because I knew this was just a portfolio piece, but I try my best to keep them fairly optimized and use the space as best as possible. So yeah, by this point I'm realizing that the automated process is a bit messy, so I opted to just kind of take the 4 main sides of the rock and then try and project that and put where the seams are. Also a few anomalies with the geometry at times where the decimates created some hidden faces and I've unwrapped it and they're kind of sitting on top of each other, so I had to sometimes try and find these errors. There's one error here where a triangle's a bit messy, so I had to fix that. So now I'd unwrapped quite a few of them and I wanted to try and bake these down, so I opted to use Substance Designer, and this made the process really quick. I created a template with some basic effects on there, so all I had to do was plug in all the baked maps and I'd get the outputs for each rock quite quickly, and then I could tweak the sort of edging effects or dirt effects where I wanted if need be, and the texturing process for this was incredibly quick. I think I spent more time trying to organise all the files and get all the folders sorted than I did actually texturing or painting. So now I've decided to come back in and fix up the ground plane, so I decided to make it square or rectangle. I've just used some procedural noise to add some variation without having to sculpt it too much, and that worked quite quickly. Then I noticed the scale was quite a bit broken, so I had to fix that. And this is just basically the base bake that I want to get for some of the noise. And for the low poly, all I did was transfer the geometry to the high poly, and I got a really nice low poly from that, and just unwrap that to a square. Bit of stretching, but it will do. Because the ground plane was so small, it didn't really matter that I was baking it to one texture. And now I'm coming back in and tweaking some things in Designer. I noticed some of the curvature maps from some of the rocks were a bit too strong, so I kind of had to find a middle ground that worked best for each rock. Just making sure all the resolutions were correct on each rock as well. And this process went really smoothly. There wasn't any bake errors really, and just allowed me to get through it really quickly. Now for the ground plane, I opted to just texture it from scratch, since it was using unique maps and needed some unique details. I wanted to try and get sort of where the water would sit in the valleys, sort of build up darker. I'm just playing around with the depth map I baked and using that to obviously create that area darker where it's wet. Spent a bit of time tweaking this, as I obviously wanted to, this was going to be a big element of the scene. I could have painted it with the terrain editor in UE4, but knowing how small the scene was going to be, I opted to go for this method. And now this was the long process of importing everything into Unreal 4. This took a while since I had a lot of unique maps and rocks to apply. So So I basically created a master material and just created instances off of that. So that would have gone a lot quicker. I just replaced the texture inputs. So I was pretty happy with how they look in engine. They came out really nice. So it's just starting to get everything in engine at this point. So obviously applying all the textures for the instances, it's got a little bit of time. I obviously have to apply those materials to each rock. And now I could finally get to starting the composition of the scene. So obviously I already had tested the composition in Blender, so it was just a matter of rebuilding that with the sort of the game ready assets. I changed the composition a little bit from the test one I did earlier, but for the most part it stayed the same. One thing it took me a while to realise is I could pin the camera to see how the composition was going, and once I knew that, it was a lot easier to see how things are going to look through the final camera. And I decided from an early start to get the post-processing volume in there so I could increase the screen space ambient occlusion and ensure that the lighting would look more final. And I was really surprised with the light bakes, and I actually just automatically did the light map on import with the new Unreal 4.5 at the time I was making this, and the light maps surprisingly were really good for the low res they were, so I was quite happy with that. So bake times were really short. And here I'm just playing with some of the post-processing effects, trying to see how the scene might look. So sort of the next element of the project that I wanted to focus on was looking at foliage, and I'd kind of had a rough idea of how it was done, but I'd never actually done it before. So I looked at some references and decided to opt for the bake method from a higher poly. Now one thing I did realise prior to making this was I made the grass blades way too thick, and I have fixed this since. But that was one thing I noted, one error I made during this process. Obviously I'm just creating some high poly stems of blades of grass and just duplicating them, making sure they kind of are in a composition that looks interesting. This was quite a quick process. Here I'm offsetting the blades to add some depth, so when I bake the ambient occlusion and depth maps it will look quite interesting, and I can use those as inputs for the shader. So once I was happy with that, I just baked it down to a plane, and this is quite a straightforward process. I had a few issues with the displacement map, but I realised I just had to check the normalize option, so our normals have come out really nice. Made a few tweaks just to make sure the texture was square, and then I could bake the displacement, ambient occlusion and normal map. These came out really nice. So the technique I opted to use was a tutorial I found online where the grass shader is actually derived from a series of masks. So you have a gradient to define the sort of transition of green to yellow at the tip of the blade, and then an ambient occlusion and depth mask to add variation to the blades of grass. And so here I'm just combining the bakes out into one map with the different channels. So I think red channel was one, green was another, and blue was another, and you end up getting this sort of weird orange and green looking texture. And now I am going to create the grass planes, so I'm importing the mask I made. I've got some alpha transparency on there as necessary with grass or any sort of foliage. And I wasn't really too sure sort of the best approach. I've seen some references, so I tried to add some depth to the plane, add a bit of curvature, and then I would duplicate these planes around and try and hide the effect that they're actually just planes. I've actually seen some other people do foliage since, and there's certain techniques I've picked up that I could do this better in the future. So for one, there's this sort of gap at the top, so if you look down you can still quite clearly see their planes. So I decided one good thing in the future is to have the planes sort of curve over the top of one another, so it hides the illusion if you're looking straight down at the grass. However, for this scene you never really look at the grass straight down, but it's key if you're making a game and you want your grass to look authentic. And one thing I realised, obviously one key technique for making decent foliage is changing the vertex normals to point upwards, so the shading of the planes blends nicer. Now by default Blender doesn't have any sort of transfer vertex options, so I had to find a script online. And then here is the test map I made, and the shader was quite versatile. So using the mask I was able to blend two colours together, and then in instance I could tweak those values where need be. So now from that test I decided to pull the grass into the main scene. Just trying to work out the right values and where to place it. Now, like I said before, I made the grass too thick. I was able to remedy that slightly by changing the scaling in the foliage tool. However, I decided to change that later with thinner grass blades and rebake the grass. So now I've had to learn another new technique, was creating water. And this is something I kind of had in the back of my head of what I had to learn at some point. And so really this isn't my shader, I'm sort of following a tutorial here, but I'm getting to grips with what's going on. And for the most part I understand it better now, and it's just all really to do with creating the illusion of sort of waves and using normals and Fresnel to get interesting viewing angles, or make the water interesting at different viewing angles. One thing I did change was making the water not opaque, or removing the refraction, I can't remember which. But I noticed when you have Fresnel on opacity or refraction, one of the two, it has some strange effects which aren't really desirable. So I ended up just removing that, and the result was much better. Now, one thing I was a bit lazy, I just reused the rock normals, and they surprisingly worked quite well for the illusion of sort of a subtle stream. So that was one plus, I suppose. I'm starting to see some results, and looks quite promising. Now, to get the water in, I opted just to use a BSP and basically just apply that water shader to the top of it. And first thing, it looks quite nice, but off the bat, like I said, there's kind of weird Fresnel issues with the opacity and refraction, so I opted to get rid of that. And so I tweaked the water a bit more, and that was it for the most part. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Maybe it gives you a bit of insight into some of the processes that you might want to learn. And if you have any questions, post away. And coming up should be the final composition and early work in progress, because I have since updated this since the video recording of this time lapse. And there we have it, the early work in progress composition. You can see the updated version in the link below. Thanks for watching.